So welcome everybody to today's patient group focused pre-consultation webinar on proposed improvements to our Pharmaceutical Reviews program. So my name's Sam Sutherland. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an engagement officer here at Canada's Drug Agency. Bienvenue à tous à notre consultation préalable auprès des organisations de patients visées sur améliorer le processus d'examen en vue du remboursement de l'Agence des médicaments du Canada. Je m'appelle Sam Sutherland, mes pronoms sont il, lui, et je suis un agent d'engagement. Le webinaire aujourd'hui sera en anglais seulement, mais je voulais simplement dire un petit bonjour à nos participants francophones. Next slide, please. So as we give a moment for everybody to arrive, I'll just go over a few housekeeping items. So today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. So later this week, we'll send a recording to everybody who's registered for the webinar. The program changes presented during the virtual event today will be fully described in a consultation document that will be posted to our website on January 6, 2025, for feedback from all interested parties. We should have time for several questions from the audience, so you can submit your questions anytime by clicking on the little box ribbon with the Q&A in it. Now, before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from our Ottawa office, which is located on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We honor all First Nations, Inuits, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. I'd invite you to take a moment to reflect on your own connection to this land and share where you're located in the chat. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned, my name's Sam, so I'll be your host for the day. I'll introduce shortly Peter Dyrda, our Director of Pharmaceutical Reviews at Canada's Drug Agency, as well as Michelle Gibbens, our Director of Engagement, who will also speak to you about the proposed improvements to our pharmaceutical reviews process. Next slide, please. So on the agenda for today, we're going to provide an overview of the Pharmaceutical Reviews Renewal Initiative. We'll also talk about how this is going to impact patients, specifically patient groups in the patient community, as well as highlight a bit of a summary and what comes next. At the end of the session, we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A session as well. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Peter Dyrda. So he's going to provide an overview of our Pharmaceutical Reviews Renewal Initiative. So take it away, Peter.
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for making the time to join us today. I'm here from joining you all from University in Adelaide at our Toronto office. As you can see, the hustling and bustling of the street behind me as people prepare for the holidays. I think what we're going to do for this session here is I'll spend most of the time here talking about a bit of an overview of what changes we're proposing. So we'll go into some level of depth, but as Sam mentioned, all of this will be posted in a document for written consultation in the new year. So, and we'll make this presentation available as well. So we'll stick to the highlights mainly. And then later on, Michelle and myself will talk a little bit about what this may mean to you as patients. What are some of the sort of key highlights? So before we get into exactly the changes we're proposing, we thought maybe it would be helpful to level set everybody who may not be as familiar with Canada's Drug Agency, what our role is exactly. And so this is a bit of a helpful slide to demonstrate where our agency fits into the continuum of access for drugs. So beginning with Health Canada, which of course looks at a regulatory approval for a drug. Oh, pardon me. Is it safe and does it work? Looking at a risk benefit profile. We then look at the product from a bit more of a comparative standpoint. So does this drug provide comparative value versus other alternatives? We provide those recommendations in a non-binding way to payers. So the way that we do that is through clinical analysis as well as an economic analysis in engagement as well with external parties such as patient groups, clinicians, and industry. Payers then at the federal, provincial, and territorial level will take our recommendations and provide listing for drugs that are given a positive recommendation from Canada's Drug Agency, and for products that are able to negotiate a successful agreement through the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. So that's a little bit on where we sit. And as far as reimbursement reviews, there's generally two types. There's the sponsored variety and the non-sponsored, which we can touch on. But generally, our role in the sponsored review side is to provide recommendations on drugs that come from manufacturers. These are generally new drugs. We generally conduct these in parallel or shortly thereafter a regulatory review. And we'll send these to two of our expert committees. So for non-oncology, we send them to the Canadian Drug Expert Committee, or CDEC. And then for oncology drugs, we'll send them to the PCODER Expert Review Committee, or PERC. In the last few years, we've also been piloting non-sponsored reviews, which you may have heard of through the Formulary Management Expert Committee, FMEC pilot. Those are generally for older drugs that have new indications. And they're generally initiated by drug plans themselves. But today we're going to focus on sponsored reviews specifically. So the life cycle of our process here. So initially you have evidence that's generated, and it's generated by industry or through clinicians. And that evidence then gets summarized and submitted to Canada's Drug Agency. We'll review that evidence and provide our take on a critical appraisal of the evidence in our reports, in our reviewer reports. And then we'll pass those review reports onto the committee. So the committee will actually take our reports and they'll deliberate themselves and come up with a recommendation. And then their recommendation will be summarized in a recommendation report. So that's how each one gets passed to the other. Within there, you can see we will request clinical specialist input and input from other interested parties, including patient groups, throughout that process. Which brings us to pharmaceutical reviews renewal. So what are our goals with this? It's really threefold. We're looking to modernize our program to adapt with the changing needs of the health system. So we want to commit to dialogue, engagement, and transparency throughout the review process, which has been highlighted in our strategic plan for this year, or for the last 3 years, I should say, which ends this year. And also improving the usefulness of our outputs. So some of the readability of our reports. We want to enable a proportionate approach. So a proportionate approach meaning equal effort to equal complexity in a proportionate way. So we really want to streamline our reviews, especially for the simple files, the lower risk files. We also want to define or redefine our complex reviews a little bit better. And then finally, we want to provide a catalyst for accelerated access. So we know that accelerated access is something that all parties are interested in. We play a role as a convener at Canada's Drug Agency, and we want to continue to play that role, and we have some ideas of how we can do so. So for the changes, we sort of tend to view these in 5 pillars or 5 areas. These are the 5 areas where we're proposing some renewal. The first is proportionate reviews. So the 3 types of reviews that we look at, our reports, so being a bit more succinct, our deliberations and how our committee conducts those deliberations transparently through our deliberative framework, accelerated access pathways, so expanding on some of the existing ones and introducing a new one, which we'll get into, and checkpoints. And checkpoints are really about the enhanced dialogue between industry and Canada's Drug Agency throughout a review of a drug. So for all the visual learners in the room like myself, I find it helpful to sort of see how all five of those areas somewhat interact with each other. So this is a bit of the process flow for drugs and how we see it, where a drug will sort of start there on the left side and move its way over to the right. So we'll start with that checkpoint, the pre-submission discussions. Then we'll receive a dossier, which will be one of three types of proportionate reviews, either a tailored review, a standard review, or a complex review. Those are our inputs. We'll then conduct our review and pass it on to the committee for a deliberation with opportunities for checkpoints. And finally, the output is our reports. So as part of report refresh, there are three report types we're introducing. So this is sort of the world in which we see it. And on top of this, accelerated access pathways are approaches of how a drug can go through our process in a bit more of a streamlined manner. So there are time-limited recommendations you might be familiar with. There's our Target Zero program, which you might be familiar with, and then there's the PACES program, which we'll introduce. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to dive into these five specific areas. So the first one around proportionate reviews. For this area, we are really looking at expanding our tailored review process. So currently we do have tailored reviews, but they're generally for product variation. So perhaps a new put up, a new formulation, combination use, for example. Here, we actually want to expand tailored reviews for drugs that are simple and low risk. So what do we mean by that? Pharmaceuticals that we anticipate have comparable efficacy and safety, or PACEs. The idea with those is that we can actually simplify these drugs or simplify our reviews for drugs that would have gone as a standard review and do them much faster. So targeting 100 to 120 days. This will be one of the areas we'll talk a little bit more about later, as it's one of the maybe three highlights that we think patients would be most interested in. The second thing, there's a couple things we want to simplify with our standard reviews. It's more around efficiency. So looking at our way of looking at outcomes through the grade method, we want to simplify. Also looking at incorporating ethics for all reviews in a bit more of a streamlined manner. So nothing sort of groundbreaking in terms of change there. It's more tinkering for standard. And then finally, for complex reviews, it's really about incorporating the best practices from our FMEC pilot, which I alluded to, and formalizing the eligibility or the definition of what a complex review is. We'll talk a little bit about that later as well. One of the things that we're introducing for the deliberations, I think, is something that we'll highlight for patients with Michelle later on. So that's the highlight for our inputs. So when we go from inputs to deliberations, the two main areas of focus here is we will be publishing the deliberative framework that's used by CDEC and PERC. So you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? Currently, they do use a deliberative framework. It just isn't published. So we've actually modernized it a bit based on best practices from around the world, and we will be publishing it now. So that'll show up on our website. And the framework we can talk about a little bit during the question session, I'm sure, but it's really an opportunity for our experts to make sure that they're asking all the right questions for every single file. Incorporating new approaches. So, pardon me. One of the new approaches we're looking at that we've trialed at FMEC is the introduction of persons with lived experience, or a new acronym for you, and apologies for that. We don't need any more acronyms, but PWLE for persons with lived experience. It's actually having people come and present directly to the committee. And Michelle will talk a little bit about that. We're going to start with our complex reviews or subtypes of them. And we think it's a really good opportunity for our experts to hear directly from patients or persons with lived experience. The other adjustment is the introduction of clinical specialists to sit during the deliberations for the whole meeting, not just for a section of the meeting. And we're actually going to ask sponsors to provide us a list of suggested clinical specialists, which is a new process. So those are the two major areas of change for deliberations. So after that, it comes down to the report refresh. So packaging our report sort of into three topics: our recommendations, our review, and then supplemental documents. So the idea is quite simple. We just want to improve the readability of our reports. Part of that is limiting our page counts. So rather than having our readers have to look for answers within very lengthy documents, we want to shorten our documents significantly. We also want to publish our recommendations and our review reports simultaneously, which will actually mean less redundancy between the two. We can refer the reports to each other and to source materials, which will actually help with the length quite a bit. And then increasing transparency. So providing a bit more context around the deliberative framework and how the committee discussed each section of the deliberative framework. We'll be posting. Things like vote counts by the committee will be posted. So with the spirit of increasing the transparency of our reports. And finally, for accelerated access, there's already two pathways. There's time-limited recommendations and target zero. So we're just refining those a little bit. For target zero, we've already launched a rolling reviews pilot. So we're just formalizing that now. I think we've got 4 active ones at the moment. So we'll be publishing criteria for what we will accept for rolling. And then for TLR, we're not changing the criteria. We're just opening it up to files that may have received a previous do not reimburse, which may have benefited from the TLR program. And that's more of a fairness issue for files prior to September 2023. The new accelerated access pathway is actually around PACEs, so the tailored reviews. So part of it is doing those faster within 100 to 120 days, which is not something that is necessarily new to us. INES has a bit of a streamlined pathway themselves. NICE and SMC have abbreviated reviews, but we're thinking that this will actually help the continuum of access, not just here, but after drugs leave CDA's remit. Finally, checkpoints, which is more for manufacturers and not so much for patients, so we'll skip over it, but we're essentially adding 2 more opportunities for dialogue. So currently we offer 3 during a review, and now we're moving up to 5, again, in the spirit of engagement and partnership. So in terms of when these changes will come into effect, essentially come April, our new fiscal year, moving forward, we'll be applying these changes to files received then. So that'll target the October 2025 deliberation meetings for CDEC and PERC. So over the next few months, we'll be doing consultation with interested parties. So we're starting with this pre-consultation call with patient groups, but we'll be posting a written document for consultation on January 6th, open till February 6th. So we'll have about a month to get your written feedback. We'll update our procedures for the end of February, and then we'll host another webinar on March 6th. And that webinar will be focused on what we proposed, what we heard, and where we landed. So to sort of close off the consultation. So for this period that's coming up in January, some instructions for you. So there are the dates for opening and closing. We'd ask that individuals and organizations identify themselves by name, 1 response per organization. And if you have any questions, to please email us at feedback@cda-amc.ca. You can also email Sam, Michelle, or myself, if you have our contacts as well, we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. All right. So that was an overview of all of the plans we have for PR renewal. We thought we would take some time to just dive in a little bit more, since we went at that over a glance, and you may have a lot of questions, and we've saved ourselves lots of time for Q&A as well. But we wanted to sort of highlight 3 areas. So here are the 3 areas we think are the most relevant for patients. So the first being the deliberative framework, the second being the accelerated access PACES pathway you may have questions on. And the third that I'll pass on to Michelle will be more details about the persons with lived experience presentations. Okay. So the deliberative framework overview, again, it's a tool that is meant to guide committee's discussions. So it's really a series of questions that we ask the committee to work through before they reach their recommendation of reimburse with conditions or do not reimburse. And these are communicated then through the recommendation report at the end. So, one of the things that are important here is that there is a deliberative framework currently. It hasn't been published, so it's not in the public domain. So we are now changing that. We will be publishing it. So now it'll be viewed by all. And then on top of that, we're also going to focus the discussion points by the committee in our recommendation reports to focus on the sort of domains within the deliberative framework. So by doing this, we're increasing transparency, and we're also hoping that patients will understand a little bit more as to how the committee reached their decision and perhaps how their input was used in that discussion. So this is a very busy slide, so I'll give you all a second. These are the 5 domains of the deliberative framework. So the idea here is that there'll be a series of questions under each one of these domains that we'll have the committee work through. And depending on how they answer their questions, it'll help guide them towards their recommendation. So the 5 domains are clinical value, which is essentially how does it work versus other relevant comparators. Unmet clinical need. So is there an issue of an unmet need that is not currently adequately addressed by a comparator? The third is distinct social and ethical considerations. So is there something around non-clinical needs that might be important context for the committee to appreciate as they think about their recommendation? And then beyond that, there's the 2 around economics. So economic considerations, perhaps the traditional economic value through cost per quality and ICERs. And then finally, the feasibility of adoption in the health system. So what kinds of criteria or conditions might be required for a technology to be adopted by the system? So these are the 5 areas where we would like the committee to focus their discussion on. And as you can see, patient input is not its own domain of value, but it's actually embedded throughout all of these. And I'm sure you can all find examples of where your input can actually play a role, particularly around unmet clinical need and the social and ethical considerations. So that's the highlight for deliberative framework. And again, we can answer any questions as we go on. Moving on to the second topic, before I pass it to Michelle, around the PACES pathway. So one of the questions we've been sort of getting is, well, how are you going to conduct these tailored reviews under PACES faster? And what does that mean? So we're looking to increase our speed by 2.5 months just for us. And then there's an opportunity for those organizations along the continuum to also accelerate. But we're not cutting any corners. We're not cutting out patient input. That'll remain. These files are still going to have an expert committee recommendation. We're just going to simplify and streamline the inputs at the beginning. So the report that's submitted to us, or the dossier that's submitted by industry, will be abbreviated, and we'll actually conduct the deliberation at a subcommittee with 2 clinical experts, a patient, and the chair, and any invited clinical specialists. They'll do the bulk of the deliberation, and then they'll bring their recommendation to the full committee. And we think that'll actually save quite a bit of time. So that's some of the details behind PACEs. And so simple, low-risk files are generally files where you expect the drugs to be similar or comparable. So, if you have a drug that is perhaps a 3rd or 4th entry into a class, that might be one example. A non-inferiority study design, where one drug is meant to look comparable to the other or assess its comparability, might be another example. We expect that up to 1 in 4 drugs may be eligible for this, but it will be up to sponsors individually to submit through this process. So we will not triage files through PACEs. Sponsors will have to choose this as one of their potential inputs, as long as they're eligible. But we think the value for this is, of course, faster time through the review process. So that's all I'll say for PACEs for now. I'll pass it on to Michelle, who will talk to us now about the persons with lived experience.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. And just before I start to add my comments, I just want to point out to folks a reminder that to ask questions, there is the Q&A at the bottom of your screen with the question mark icon there. Use that function to submit your questions, and we'll get to them as we move into the question and answer period after we share just a little bit more information. As Peter's mentioned, the part that I'm going to touch on is how, in the context of the changes that he's outlined, we're looking at changes to enhancing how patient perspectives are incorporated in recent reimbursement reviews. As I'm sure many or most of you are aware, that we have had a relatively long-standing process for inviting patient and clinician group input at the early stages of the review process, and that patient group input that is submitted is used to inform both the clinical and economic review reports, as Peter has already mentioned, and is also used subsequently by the expert committee to inform their deliberations. So it's been a key aspect of the reimbursement reviews, continues to be a key aspect. The thing that we wanted to highlight today is the change that we have been testing and learning on over the last year and a bit, and are hoping to address, are proposing to expand in the current suite of changes, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. But the change that we're talking about is having persons with lived experience. So that's patients, caregivers, family members who can share perspectives on their treatment journey and experience, and the implications of the treatment under review. And they do that by presenting to the deliberative committee just ahead of their deliberation on a specific pharmaceutical treatment. And there's an opportunity for them to present their experience, but also an opportunity for the committee to ask questions of them about the information and their experience that they've shared, so that they can have that opportunity for interaction as well. Next slide, please. So to emphasize that what the intention behind this persons with lived experience presentations have been. We've been testing this with non-sponsored reviews from the that go to the Formulary Management Expert Committee for deliberation since our testing has been underway since June of 2023. And that has provided us with the opportunity to test both the approach, but also clarify the purpose and the role that these presentations play in our overall approach to having patients contributing input and being involved in the reimbursement review process. So the purpose of including the lived experience presentations for committee members is to ensure that the voices of those directly impacted by the treatment under review are heard by the expert committee just prior to the initiation of their deliberation. It is intended to be complementary or supplementary to the written input received from patient groups. It doesn't replace it. The thinking in initiating this was that a two-pronged approach would provide the opportunity to have both those insights that patient groups are able to provide at a more collective, broader level, but also an opportunity to interact with at a more individual level around their treatment journey and experiences. So having the combination approach and the opportunity for the committee to interact directly with patients and caregivers. And by hearing firsthand about real-world challenges, needs, and preferences of patients and caregivers, that opportunity to ask questions, that committee members could have an opportunity to gain some additional clarity or deeper insights, particularly in situations where they may not have the same level of familiarity, or there may be complexities to be considered in the review, and it provides an opportunity for that to happen in advance of the deliberation commencing. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, we've been testing this process. The engagement team has been working very closely with the Pharmaceutical Reviews team in testing this process for more than a year now, and have had the experience of the Formulary Management Expert Committee being able to benefit from the persons with lived experience presentation and question and answer opportunity on 19 non-sponsored reviews to this point. This experience and working closely with patient organizations in collaborating on identifying persons with lived experience to present to the committee has really allowed us to develop our process around this, refine that process, further refine it over additional experiences. And I'll just touch briefly, not in detail. There's more detail on the slides that you'll have for future reference, but just on that overall approach, I'll highlight. So the process to identify someone for lived experience to present to the committee starts early in the review process, around the same time as the call for patient input is initiated, so that there is that opportunity to connect, outreach to patient groups, to explore their interest in collaborating with us on identifying someone to present, to explain the process and how that would be undertaken. It does involve some introductory, preparation both for the organization and for individuals in terms of understanding the process since it's been new. And then there's the actual presentation itself that I've mentioned occurs at the time of the the expert committee's meeting, and ensuring that the patient or caregiver who is presenting has plenty of opportunity to present throughout, or to be supported throughout that process. And that's something that's been very important and emphasized by persons with lived experience and the patient organizations we've been working with, that we're attentive to the supports that are necessary to do this well. And then, circling back with those that have participated to ensure how Their experience is represented in the report, and their presentation is represented in the report, is reflected. And we also provide honoraria to patients and caregivers who have participated by presenting as well. So this is a process that has been established with for the non-sponsored reviews with the Formulary Management Expert Committee. And the proposed changes, as Peter alluded to before, are feeling like we are in a position to begin to expand this into some of the sponsored reviews. And that's what I'll explain more about now. So what we're proposing is that based on the experiences that we have had, that there is an opportunity to begin to expand the persons with lived experiences. Next slide, please, Peter. So aligned with the other changes that Peter has already outlined, this would be expanding this initiative to certain reviews that are going to the Canadian Drug Expert Committee and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Expert Review Committee, starting with committee meetings in October, which would be working us back in the process to this spring, early in our new fiscal year in April, doing the first outreach around persons with lived experience. Peter mentioned before that the specific review areas that we're looking at introducing this in are complex reviews, and specifically the scenarios of complex reviews involving a first drug indicated in a therapeutic area, and the second scenario being drugs that are undergoing Health Canada priority review as an indicator of a potential game-changing from the perspective of a treatment that may have significant implications for shifts in the treatment paradigm, significant changes, to be considered and reflected on in that. And the reason for selecting this as our next place to expand is that we really feel that this is a place where there's, the potential for either gaps or uncertainty in evidence that the persons with lived experience presentation can contribute to. The patient group input will also be contributing to our understanding and the review in those scenarios as well. But as I've explained, having that persons with lived experience presentation provides that additional opportunity as the committee is about to go into deliberation to clarify anything and that they may have. And, by focusing on these complex reviews that are, earlier in our experience, that these are maybe quite possibly also situations where the committee may not have as much familiarity either with the condition or the treatment, those kinds of things. And so again, an opportunity where some clarification and gaining some additional insight in advance of deliberation could be particularly beneficial. So that's why we're proposing that as the next place to start. We're very attentive to a couple of things on this. One, that as we expand the number of persons with lived experience presentations, that we're continuing to provide the level of support that has been positively received and that we've been told is very critical to this being a safe and meaningful experience for those involved. And so we want to continue to provide that. Some of you may recognize that, some of you that may have been involved in this process of persons with lived experience presentations for the Formulary Management Expert Committee may recognize Sam, our host today, as an engagement officer that's been supporting that process. And we'll continue to have engagement officers involved in supporting the process as we move forward. And the other thing is that we're very attentive to wanting to make sure that this is not just a presentation for presentation's sake, that there is this opportunity is important because it can be meaningful and add value both for the committee in terms of enhancing their awareness and understanding of implications of the treatment, but also be a meaningful experience from the patient's perspective, a caregiver's perspective, in terms of their involvement and the opportunity to have a meaningful contribution to the committee's understanding. So next slide, please. So just before we move into question and answer opportunities, and thank you, I think we're receiving a few questions, so looking forward to engaging in that. Really just wanted to summarize the changes that Peter and I have described. We hope that in what we've shared today that you can see that we are listening. We have heard feedback on a number of these points over time, and are looking to continue to improve, and hope that you see responses to feedback that you may have provided over time in some of the changes that we've given an overview of today. And as Peter emphasized in some of the changes that he noted, our focus on improving clarity and transparency is a real priority for us, and particularly ensuring that the changes will help us to add clarity to how patient input is used and considered throughout the process, and how that informs the recommendation development process. And just to restate what Peter already emphasized, that patient group input remains a key element of the reimbursement review for all types of reviews, including those that may go through a different pathway and be abbreviated in some ways. Patient group input will still be an important part of that. Next slide, please. The consultation period, again, will be open from January 6th to February 6th for any of you that are interested in contributing to this written consultation. The process, when it's open, you'll see, is relatively open-ended, so it facilitates your opportunity to comment and provide feedback on the aspects of changes that you feel are relevant or that you want to make comment on. There's not an expectation or a requirement that you comment on all aspects of the changes in order to contribute and during this consultation period. If you if you do not currently subscribe to our e-alerts, subscribing will provide you with opportunities for updates and to be informed when the consultation period opens. And the last point I want to make before we move to the question and answers is that no, I've spoken with several of you, other team members have spoken with a number of you as well around the opportunity to evolve our patient and clinician group input processes, and that is a priority for us as well. And following fairly quickly on this consultation period that we're just introducing, we will be engaging with patients around how we evolve the patient and clinician group input processes. That's not part of the suite of changes that we've discussed today, but that is our next step for making changes and further improvements to reimbursement reviews. So looking both at the information that's needed and requested from patients and how we obtain that information from patients. We have feedback that we're considering. We're looking at what others are doing, other HTA organizations are doing, and look forward to connecting with patient organizations in the first quarter of 2025 further on that. So again, happy to receive questions during the question and answer period around the changes we've outlined today, but also wanting to signal that we very much in view for us the need to look at additional changes beyond those outlined today. So, and with that, I will pass it back to Sam.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, Peter, for that great overview. So we do have a number of questions already submitted for the Q&A. It's great to see so much interest. So please feel free to continue submitting your questions through the Q&A feature. But we'll start off with the first question, and I think this one would be for Peter. Peter, would generics be eligible for the PACES review or a tailored review, or would they just go through the same process?
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for the question. So I think to clarify, we don't review generic drugs through our sponsored review program. So when generics are launching their versions onto the market, they do not submit to Canada's Drug Agency for review. Where we do see drugs that are beyond exclusivity, whether they are at or beyond exclusivity and may have generic versions, We do see the non-sponsored reviews, which are not initiated by manufacturers, but are initiated by payers. And so they're the only way we would review a drug that has generic versions would be through FMEC, through non-sponsored reviews. And yes, FMEC has the ability to conduct reviews as well through the tailored pathway. Part of the sort of vision and purpose for FMEC is to be a bit of a testing ground and a sandbox for how we conduct reviews and how we do deliberations. And so one of the things that we will be testing, just like we tested the persons with lived experience component at FMEC, we'll also be looking at testing the templates we've put together for tailored reviews through FMEC as well in the new year. So it is possible that a generic may go through a tailored review at FMEC, but generics would not come through CDEC or PERC.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, for answering the question. The next one was actually going to be for Michelle. So Michelle, we've received a few different questions from participants wondering for the presentations, persons with lived experience, would they be in attendance virtually or in person at committee meetings?
Okay. Most committee meetings are virtual, and so I think to date, the presentations have all been virtual to date. So I'm anticipating that that's likely the case moving forward. But again, we're adapting and the processes that have been used for FMEC to CDEC and PERC, but anticipating that most of that would be virtual.
Thanks, Michelle. And maybe a follow-up question to that. Many participants are wondering how patients are actually selected to participate in this process.
Right. Okay. Very good question. And so I mean, one of the considerations is the experience of the persons with lived experience in terms of the type of experience that's relevant to the drug under review. And then the other consideration is someone who's comfortable sharing their experience in the context of, a deliberative committee meeting that of the size and various representatives that are there. So the process of outreach that Sam and other engagement officers would use is to identify, what organizations might be able to help us and interested in collaborating with us on identifying a person with lived experience, starting with, ideally, best case scenario would be someone who has the condition under review, the indication of that condition that's relevant for the drug and indication under review, but with some treatments that are newer, that may be very difficult to find someone who has experience with the particular specific treatment under review. So again, looking for someone who has that, relevant experience quite aligned with the drug under review and the indications for the condition, the conditions and the specific indications for the drug under review. And then, depending on if we're able to find somebody in that situation, if not, then it may be broader to experience with the condition that's relevant for the drug under review and experience with the treatment journey for that condition that could still be informative to the review. So a bit of a nuanced process, and that's why we start very early on at the beginning of the review process, so that even though the committee meeting will be a few months down the road, it is an important part of the process to have individuals who meet that criteria that might be interested in presenting have an opportunity to consider that opportunity. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, one of our participants mentioned, so based off their observation, or based off our observations from the testing of FMEC, they wondered if there's any recurring topics or themes where the committee found the person with lived experience presentation especially beneficial to supporting the deliberation discussions. Maybe I'll pass that one over to Peter to answer first, and Michelle can always hop in afterwards if she wanted to add anything.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really good question because of the 19 that we have conducted, I think there is a wide variety of different sort of takeaways from the input. And actually, if you look at any of our FMEC reports, we summarize as well what the committee heard from the person with lived experience. So you can sort of get a sense of what sort of the key discussion points were. But when we reflected on this and how we could bring these persons with lived experience presentations to CDEC and PERC, the discussion often went towards files where there was a very heavy burden of illness with a low awareness by the committee of the drugs or condition. And so, typically in areas where the clinicians had a lot of questions, and in areas where there weren't a lot of options. So the one that I tend to think of is there was a drug for glioblastoma, which is a very aggressive form of cancer. And there aren't really very many options at all. And, we had, there was a young woman who joined and provided her lived experience and some of the challenges facing such an aggressive cancer with such little options and with treatments that had quite high toxicity. And I think, it provided our committee the opportunity to be able to create that dialogue and ask questions about how this new drug under review might fit in, because the data for the new drug had its challenges as well, of course. But the context of what the alternatives were was very compelling. And so when we thought, how can persons with lived experience sort of supplement the great work we get from patient input submissions from groups, and how can it supplement the patient members' presentations at our committees? Because we do have patient members who present on every file, the input that is provided. We thought, those areas around these sort of more complex reviews is a really good place to start. And that's the reason why we thought this is a good place for CDEC and PERC to begin and be able to see how this can be incorporated. And as Michelle noted, looking into the future, getting more experience with this, seeing if there's opportunities to potentially expand, beyond next fiscal year. But, I think that was from our experience that we thought that was the most compelling place to begin. And Michelle, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think the only thing I would add is that we'll be continuing to learn, even as we look at expanding to complex reviews and anticipate that a year from now we would have a more, we'd have a more robust answer around what are those places, where, are those opportunities for these presentations to really have that meaningful contribution to the process that complements what patient groups are already providing. So I think we'll learn more if we proceed with the proposed changes to introduce to some complex reviews.
Awesome. Thank you both for that detailed response. Just a reminder, because we are receiving quite a few questions in the chat, the slides of today will be shared following the webinar. We will have a recording available. Again, we'll share that with those that are registered. And again, the document for written submission will be coming on January 6th. But my question now would probably be more for Peter. So Peter, maybe not as related to today's topic, but it's more on the non-sponsored review side. Can non-sponsored reviews be requested by any group?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way we've set up non-sponsors currently is that that each one must have not a sponsor, but a champion, whether it be a federal, provincial, or territorial drug plan. Because there are no fees that are collected from our end to conduct these reviews. These reviews are sort of wholly resourced by the drug plans through our sort of public budget. The discussion that we've had is that drug plans must champion the files, and there's been such a demand for non-sponsored reviews that, in fact, they've now had to sort of go on to prioritizing them. So I believe they are sort of booking into next summer's FMEC meetings with non-sponsored reviews. So there's quite a bit of demand. So because of that, there's no discussion around opening up the requesters. However, I think what we've seen is that if there are patient groups that have a case, my advice would be to bring that to your local FPT representative and see if they can bring it to our advisory committees to put it on the table as part of the discussion for prioritization. So that would be any members within drug plans or cancer agencies across the country outside Quebec. We meet monthly. One group is the Formulary Working Group, that's for non-oncology, and then the Provincial Advisory Group is for oncology, or PEG. So they meet monthly and discuss these files. So I would suggest sort of reaching out to a local representative from the drug plans if there is a topic that you think should be raised.
Thanks, Peter. That's really helpful to hear from. I think this next question will be more for Michelle. Maybe it's kind of a two-pronged question. Michelle, I guess question one was, does lived experience include caregivers as well as patients? And the second piece to that is, with this new deliberative framework, will the clinician input and patient input templates be updated as well?
Thank you for that. So to take the first, yes, and part of the reason why we've been using the language of persons with lived experience around these presentations is acknowledging that it may be a patient with experience of living with a condition who's presenting, or it may be in some circumstances a caregiver or another family member, or with the FMEC experience, we have had a few situations where patients and caregivers have joined the committee together and each shared their perspective. So it absolutely does include that. And very good, call out about the changes to the patient and clinician group input template. We, anticipating around the changes with the deliberative framework as it was outlined, certainly how to adapt the template was in our view, but so as I mentioned, we will be moving forward with looking at the patient and clinician group input processes more broadly. Anticipate that at a minimum changes to the template will be coming, but also wanted to open up a broader conversation around the information that we're that that we're asking for because of, what's useful and informative to the review process and the deliberative process, but also how we ask for that, how we receive that. And so there will be changes and absolutely alignment with the deliberative framework, and, anticipating that being part of how we move forward is very much in view, and look forward to taking the next steps on that in the new year.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It sounds like some exciting work coming up. So we have the next question is for Peter. So Peter, can you help us understand how the person with lived experience input is weighted against the other components you consider when making decisions about drugs in Canada?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's often a question we get when it comes to the deliberative framework in general. And, we often get questions around, well, how much did our input factor in to the recommendation, whether it's the patient input that we have always collected and summarized, whether going forward it will be, these presentations with persons with lived experience. Those are great questions. And I think what will become much clearer going forward with our report refresh and the deliberative framework is we will be providing a summary of the sort of key discussion points by those 5 domains of value within the deliberative framework of where patient input was discussed. And so with that format, we're hoping that that'll provide much more transparency into how our committees reach their recommendation in general, but also a bit more context for where patient input was discussed. But what I'll mention now, as we've said before, there is no weighting of any of the evidence that we receive. There is also no weighting of the 5 domains of value and the deliberative framework. It's not a formula or a formulaic approach. It's really the deliberation is, ensuring that all the different perspectives are thought through carefully and addressed. And so the committee will certainly have the opportunity to do that with these complex reviews by actually having, for the first time ever, someone external to the committee come and present to them. So, we're confident that the committee will certainly hear what the persons with lived experience are saying, because they'll have that opportunity for actually direct live engagement. But as far as a weighting of how any types of evidence or input are considered, there is no sort of formal way of doing so.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's really helpful. My next question goes back to Michelle. Michelle, often for patients to feel at ease and effective in these types of consultation processes or presenting, pre-meeting support and coaching is really helpful. So what are we doing at the organization for kind of preparation ahead of those committee meetings?
Yeah, thanks for that. And that's what I had referred to in general terms of the importance of supporting those who agree to share their experience through these presentations, and being presenting to the expert committee. That is really important that we support that, and that does start up front with having an introductory call with the person or persons with lived experience, and whether that be a patient and caregiver, or caregiver, offering again in our experience with FMEC, that has often we've met that person through a patient organization, been introduced the person through a patient organization. So it's also up to them if they want to, to have someone from the patient organization attend as well. And we make sure that they have familiarity, not just with the process, but, do they know who Canada's Drug Agency is, what our mandate is, why we do reimbursement reviews, and the committee that they'll they'll be presenting to. We have, discussed conflict of interest and consent, and how they'll be compensated or recognized with an honoraria. Provide some guidelines for the presentation based on the learnings that we've had to date, and also engagement officer available to support them as they're preparing their presentation. And we provide emotional support, have that available during the committee meeting and in follow up to the committee meeting, and ensure to close the loop so that they have feedback from that process as well. So there's a range of things that we're doing throughout the process, right from the initial contact with someone who is agreeing to be present, to make sure that we're not just preparing them, but making sure that they are feeling prepared, but also supporting them through that process so that it feels safe and comfortable for them along the way. So.
Thank you, Michelle. That's really helpful to better understand. I know that's a question that was raised quite often. I'm going to pass it back over to Peter.
Actually, Sam, I'm just going to add, as I saw that there was also a question very specifically about individuals with mental health or addictions, and reviews that may be coming up for individuals with those types of health conditions, and that there might be particular considerations. And so I would say that, that has been in our view, that we have not yet had the opportunity for that experience yet. But again, having conversations with organizations to ensure that if there's additional supports and considerations that we need to be building in, that would be part of our process up front as well. So.
Thank you, Michelle. So my next question would be back to Peter. So Peter, the question is, would rare disease files be looked at differently from non-rare disease files?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's also one we get fairly frequently, and so currently we do have within our procedure. So this is not a change. This is how we are currently operating, and so that will continue. But currently, the way that we look at drugs for rare diseases is that if a drug does meet the definition of a drug for rare disease, then there is a discussion held by the committee about whether there should be perhaps a greater allowance for uncertainty. And so often what we see with drugs for rare diseases is that the evidence that we receive from sponsors, because drugs for rare disease typically have fewer patients and smaller diseases, or less prevalence, I should say, smaller trials. So, the evidence is generally not as clear, or there's not as much confidence necessarily in some of the evidence. And so there's a recognition of that for drugs that are for rare conditions. And the committee works through a discussion of acknowledging the rarity of the condition. Should they provide sort of greater allowance for some of this uncertainty in the evidence that they're seeing? So that will continue going forward. And I would say that's the one difference between a drug that is reviewed for rare disease versus a non-rare disease.
Thank you, Peter. And while you're already unmuted, I think the last question of the day will go to you. And so there was one question about the funding algorithm process and whether or not any of these changes would impact that process. Are there any changes coming down the pipeline for the algorithm process?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so the provisional funding algorithm, just in case folks aren't aware, that's a process whereby after, and it's just for oncology, after our PERC committee provides a recommendation, sometimes payers will ask us for advice on sort of demonstrating where the product under review might fit in terms of its reimbursement relative to other comparators. Sometimes those are sort of simple discussions, and others they are complicated because of a lack of evidence and require clinical expert panels. Generally, these are relatively new for us over the last few years, but we actually went through a bit of a PFA refresh last year. And actually, there's been a set of updates that have been applied as of this past summer. The PFA, the algorithms program has undergone some renewal of its own, but it did so about 5-6 months ago. And so looking into next year as part of the PR renewal, we're not looking to change it again. What we're focused on is sort of those 5 areas we talked about through the presentation, which is really about from checkpoints to our inputs, throughputs, outputs, and accelerated access mechanisms within the program.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. So with that brings us to the end of the Q&A period here. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us and learn more about our Pharmaceutical Reviews program renewal at Canada's Drug Agency. I really appreciate the time you've taken to join us today. It's great to see so much interest in this work. Merci à tous pour votre participation aujourd'hui. Nous apprécions le temps que vous avez pris pour nous joindre et nous sommes heureux de voir tellement d'intérêt dans ce travail. I'd like to thank Peter and Michelle for joining us today and walking through all of these changes. But just in terms of closing remarks, you can go to the next slide, Peter. You can visit our website to sign up for our weekly updates to be advised of the posting of the feedback document. Again, so it's going to be posted on January 6th until February 6th. The recording will be available on YouTube, and the link to that will be shared to all those registered, along with the slides from today as well. Please fill out the post-event survey if you can by clicking on the checkmark icon at the top of your screen. And lastly, just thank you so much for engaging with us today and attending. If you'd like to contact us, all of our social medias links are there. You can also email us directly at our requests@cda-amc.ca, and we can triage your email to the right team. So with that, we can close this session, but wishing you all a gentle end to the year. Thank you.